a few friends in the party persuaded me to stand for election, and now here we are. So yeah, I've been a councillor in Bristol since 2015. I'm actually stepping down this May in order to focus on trying to get elected as the MP. But that means that I'm happy to answer any questions about local stuff as well as national stuff. But yeah, enough of the introduction. I think let's get on with the questions.
That's it, brilliant. Thanks, Carla. It's well done. And I am really looking forward to it. It's going to be really interesting. Fang Debonair up against Carla Denyer in the news. Bristol Central is going to be a neck and neck. And really interesting. We'll come to that in a minute. But Carla, as it's a vegan event, I'm sure the first question everybody will always ask you is just tell us about the vegan journey. What prompted you? What was the triggers? How did you get into this way of life?
It was quite gradual for me. When people ask me how long I've been vegan, it's hard to pick a date because it didn't happen overnight. Probably what helped start the journey is that in the 2 years at uni that I lived out in a shared house with friends, both of those houses were mostly vegetarian houses. I wasn't veggie, but because we cooked together, I learned how to cook loads of veggie things. But by the time I graduated, I still wasn't even vegetarian, even though I was probably eating veggie or vegan about half the time. I feel like the journey was starting to happen in my head, and then I moved to Bristol, and partly because it was so easy to be vegan in Bristol, even back then, let alone now, I quite quickly dropped milk and eggs and yogurt out of my diet and switched to vegan versions. Cheese and butter took a little bit longer, but I think I've been fully vegan for about 12 or 13 years now, I think, roughly.
Nice.
For me, it's mainly the environmental impact, although, of course, the animal rights side is important too, but I would say that wasn't the factor that first pushed me in that direction.
What do you think, how do you think it's changed? 13 years is quite a long time to be vegan. Would you say your understanding of veganism has deepened, and has it changed at all? Has it sort of awoken anything in there?
I definitely think I've got better at understanding nutrition, and I'm sure I eat more balanced diets now than I used to. In terms of understanding, I don't know. It took me a while to realise I needed to take B12 supplements, for example, as I think it does lots of people. I don't know. I like to think I was fairly clued up on environmental stuff before, and like I did, for example, but when I stopped buying milk, which would have been 2009, 10ish probably. I remember doing the research into what kind of vegan milk was the lowest carbon, and I feel like we've all, but like it feels like oat milk is the one that pretty much everyone's settled on now, which was the one I settled on then as well. So I feel very vindicated that I made the right decision.
It's a good rebuff whenever people go on about almond milk. It's like oat milk, self-pollinated, and bees.
And I've recently switched from buying the cartons to getting the home delivery of float milk.
That's really good.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, so that's really important. So what I'm going to ask you actually, Carla, is I've asked you to do an elevator pitch.
Okay.
So we're going to ask Carla to just talk as if none of you were vegan. I'm assuming there's probably a few people who aren't vegan in the audience. You don't need to raise your hands, it's all right, you're very good hands. We're comfortable, we're good, we're an inclusive show. But Carla, how do you describe to somebody, you think, in under a minute, if you're in the elevator and you were going to try and encourage someone to go vegan, what would you say to them?
Okay, I haven't rehearsed and timed this, but I think the main argument for me is that it is a really good way of lowering your carbon emissions and also getting healthier. And at least for myself, I think it helped me to be happier as well, it seems. And in the UK over the last 10 years, it's become so much easier to be vegan full time. When I was first vegan, I was vegan when I was at home, but I was a bit more flexible when I was eating out because sometimes it felt like it was necessary in order to get a balanced diet. That is no longer the case in the UK, and especially not in Bristol. It's easier than it's ever been. There's brilliant options, especially in this city, and it doesn't feel feasible to you to go 100% vegan overnight, that's okay. Being vegan 99% of the time is 99% of the benefit.
Thank you, Carla. Okay, so we're going to move on now. Has that convinced anyone? Anybody in the audience going to go vegan? Yes! Okay, so and it is, I mean, whatever way you look at it, it is a journey. And I mean, I've been vegan 40 years now, but I'd say I've deepened my understanding of veganism more in the last 7 or 8 years, just because I've been paying attention to all the conferences that we've been doing, but listening to some of the speakers. But I think I like that veganism is it's for me, every day is a new day with it. I never get bored of it. Absolutely not. It's great. Well, I'm sure some of my family probably do. So, Carla, we're living in Bristol. Bristol has yet to endorse the plant-based treaty. We know why. We're just waiting for a change in the way that Bristol operates, really, isn't it? So that rather than these decisions being made by the mayor, they'll be made by a committee, I believe. So we're hoping that Bristol's going to be endorsing the plant-based treaty pretty soon, hopefully in June. As soon as you get a chance. But tell us a bit about what about from your experience as a councillor? We want to see a shift to plant-based food systems. What's been happening in Bristol that might encourage us? What are some of the things that we're seeing that you might say moving in the right direction?
Yeah, well, I already mentioned that there's so many more exclusively vegan restaurants and also just places that have extensive vegan options on the menu now, which definitely makes it easier when you're out and about. But I do think that the council and other kind of big institutions could do more to make sure that they're offering plant-based menus, at least as an option, if not as the main or only option, whether that's at council events, meetings, school menus, that kind of thing. So I just want to explain a little bit about what Tim said about the plant-based treaty. Probably most of you are aware of it, but you might not know the details of what we've been trying to do in Bristol. Martin Fodor, who is one of my fellow Green Party councillors on Bristol City Council and also a VegFest regular, has been proposing a motion based on the plant-based treaty. It's actually, if I may big him up a little bit, I think it's even better than the template plant-based treaty motion that the organisation produced, because he's tailored it specifically to the powers that Bristol City Council has, so there's some extra actions in there that are Bristol relevant. So we've been proposing that to the last few full council meetings, but the way full council works under the current model, where there is a single directly elected mayor who has almost all the power, and then the other councillors don't have very much power and only have very infrequent opportunities to put things forward. It means that it hasn't yet reached the top of the list, and so it hasn't reached the point where it gets debated in a meeting and gets voted on, even though it's been on the order paper. It's a little bit like how opposition MPs, people like Caroline Lucas, put forward early day motions on environmental and animal rights things, but they don't always reach as far as being debated. But as Tim mentioned, we're switching from the directly elected mayor model to a committee way of organising on the council straight after the local elections on the 2nd of May this year. And that encourages more cross-party working, collaboration, and it should mean that more decisions can be made at committee level rather than everything having to go to the relatively small amount of time available at the full council meetings that only happen 10 times a year. One of my other Green councillor colleagues, Lorraine, has just caught my eye at the back. Hi, Lorraine. Cool. So yes, I can't give you a date. And if the Greens do become part of the administration after the 2nd of May, there is a lot we need to do, but this will definitely be one of the things that we want to do.
Bring it on.
On that note, how can people help with that? Is there anything that you'd like to see from, the people? Because obviously it's as you mentioned, it's moving, it's a system change, isn't it, from the mayor to the council to the committee. But can the people of Bristol do anything to encourage, I know you support it, but what about the rest? What about the rest of councillors? What can we do?
It is worth writing to your local councillor about it if you haven't already. But I think quite a few of you probably have, because I've certainly received a few emails about it. But if you haven't, you can look up who your local councillor is on the council website, or just Google "Find Your Councillor Bristol," and there's a page where you put in your postcode and it gives you the contact details for your local councillors. A quick note, it is only really worth writing to your local councillors, not all 70 councillors on the council, because our job is to represent the people who live in our wards. So it'll take you longer and not really gain you anything to email all 70, but find it's usually 2 councillors per ward, in some areas it's 1 or 3, and let them know that this matters to you, and that means that when we do manage to get it on the agenda, we'll hopefully have support from more of the politicians from other parties as well.
And if we are successful, which we all hope we will, I've been watching, you're probably aware, something that various councils across the country have already done this. So we've got Haverty, we've got Norwich, we've got Edinburgh, Exeter, I think, Exmouth. So what we're seeing is, what I'd like to ask is, what do you think will happen if and when we endorse the plant-based treatment? Then what happens? What are we going to see action-wise from the council that could really help make a difference in a shift to plant-based food systems?
Well, I anticipated this question, and I have a copy of Martin's motion.
Oh!
So the actions that Martin put in so the format of council motions is this council notes a load of facts about the carbon impact of meat and dairy, for example, beliefs, so that's values, and then the actions bit. And so it's things like ensure that food provided at all council-sponsored events and meetings is entirely plant-based, using ingredients sourced from local food suppliers where appropriate, etc., etc. Ensure that council school meals services have plant-based menus available on at least 2 days per week. That's slightly ambiguous wording, I don't know if that's from the template. I think that means vegan 2 days a week and vegan option all the time, surely.
Every day.
There's also stuff, so he broadened it out a bit to like ethical sourcing generally, so also talking about sourcing from local food producers where possible. One of the things that Bristol City Council has some influence over, even though it doesn't have complete control, is public events in the city centre have to get a licence from Bristol City Council to operate. And so if it's an event organised by some other organisation, the council can't mandate the whole event to be vegan, but they can mandate that there are vegan options at them. They can mandate that they don't use any single-use plastics, etc., etc. So those could be put in as the criteria that you have to meet in order to run a big public outdoor event in Bristol. So that's the kind of thing. So we have to bear in mind that Bristol City Council is not the whole of Bristol. In fact, after 14 years of cuts from the Conservative government, the council has less and less staff and less resources, and so more and more things are outside of the council's direct control. So this won't turn Bristol vegan overnight, nothing like it, but it will mean that more events and meetings are plant-based, and hopefully that will help with the council providing a positive influence to the rest of the city and showing how good plant-based food can be, but without forcing anyone to do anything, which I think is an important distinction.
Yeah, so it's very much about increasing plant-based options rather than perhaps reducing meat and dairy into, flexitarian. It's about basically increasing plant-based options wherever you can.
Exactly. In fact, I skipped over it, but one of the other points in the motion is about menus having the plant-based options at the top along flexitarian principles of the kind of nudge theory of those being the first ones people spot.
And one thing I think, wondering, just on a general point, most people when they go vegan, we talk about, we're either vegan for the animals, or we're vegan for environmental grounds, or we're vegan for health grounds. But the fourth issue, which for me was really important, actually what I worked on 40 years ago, was really about food justice and food sovereignty. This is a really big issue in Bristol, but every city in the country, and every country in the world. The food sovereignty is something that plant-based food systems can really address. And what I'd love to see, and I just wondered if, allotments and inner city growth is the area that I would see that if the council got behind allotments in inner city and urban farming with the grants, the investment, the subsidies, we would see a real big intake, not just in plant-based options, but also that key issue of food sovereignty, which means Bristol people producing their own food and making sure there's even distribution and that everybody gets access to cheap, plant-based, cheap, healthy plant-based options. So are there any plans? Can we see a big explosion of of growing in Bristol?
I certainly hope so. I'm really chronically ungreen-fingered myself, but I am an active member of Sims Hill Shared Harvest, which is a community-supported agriculture project. I was one of the early members, and I used to volunteer on the marketing side, which I'm somewhat better at than growing. And so one of the appeals of that for me, it's basically a veg box, but rather than you being a customer of a company, it is a members cooperative, where you either contribute your labour or you contribute your money, and in exchange you get a week's worth of veg, and it's almost all grown on their site on the edge of Bristol. So the majority of my fresh veg has got food, about 2 food miles on it, and that's really important to me. And yeah, currently Bristol is not set up so that the majority of people can do that, but I really support all of the projects, and obviously that's not the only one, it's just the one I'm involved in, but I really support all those projects that help show how it can be done at a city level. In terms of allotment specifically, I'm not going to pick on you, but just show of hands, who's been following the debacle about the allotments in Bristol over the last few weeks? Few, yeah. So we got some good news on that just a couple of days ago. I don't know if you saw. If you want details on it, if you go to bristolgreenparty.org.uk, we put an article up literally yesterday afternoon that explains the news. The aforementioned Green Councillor Martin Fowler has just walked in. Give everyone a wave, Martin. Martin's the author of the plant-based motion I was just talking about. So, what was I saying? Allotments. Yes, so the Bristol City Council, i.e. the current Labour administration, announced some changes to the allotment fees, and also lots of rules about how you can use your allotments and how they need to be maintained and so on. And it was quite out of the blue, with not very much consultation, and a lot of people involved in the allotments were rightly very frustrated by that. And it seemed like the message that we were getting from most allotment holders and people on the waiting list was that they didn't necessarily disagree with the fact that fees needed to go up, because they've been frozen for several years and we recognise there's been inflation, but that rather than going up gradually with inflation, they were just suddenly leaping up in price with no warning, which if you're on a low income is hard to afford. And of course, one of the reasons that allotments were created in the first place was to give everyone, no matter your income, access to good quality food. And so it's really important that allotments don't become the preserve of the middle classes, that they should be accessible to everyone. And we do need more allotment sites in this city and the country so that more people have access to them, and it tackles the waiting list. Anyway, the news that was from like 2 days ago is that we have secured not quite a complete U-turn, but a pause on those proposals to change the rules around allotments. So the administration has agreed to not progress those proposals for now, and to leave the decision for the next administration after the local election on the 2nd of May. So that's something that we'll be able to look at cross-party in the summer.
That's great news. And just on the allotments, I'm just going to mention a pilot study done by Brighton University in 2021, which demonstrated up to 40% of the UK's fruit and vegetables could be grown on allotments and inner city farming. So urban farming and inner city farming and allotments are, for me, they're probably the highest on the agenda, because they're long-term solutions. And as much as we want to see more plant-based options in schools and hospitals and colleges and events, actually growing our own food in Bristol is, and if that model could be rolled out around the country, and suddenly we have nearly half our fruit and veg produced in this country in local areas for the local people, that would be a huge step forward. So just moving on that, actually moving nationally. So Carla, you've been a councillor, but now you're standing to be a potential MP. I'm sure you're confident. It's neck and neck. We're all really excited. I'm in the middle. I haven't quite made up my mind yet, so
I'm not confident at all, precisely because it's neck and neck. I'm not taking anything for granted.
but you've got a very good chance, is what I'm saying. And given that Tanya Debonair, the sitting MP, had I think something like a 70% majority on the last election.
Yeah, different constituencies.
Different constituencies changed now, the boundaries have changed, but it's resulted in a current neck and neck, I understand, so it's very exciting. I'm very excited anyway. But look, you're co-leader of the Green Party. Tell me more about how the national, what about national? We talked about regional, national policies. If you get into as an MP, what are we going to see?
Yeah, so I think, firstly on animal rights, I think the Green Party has the best policies on animal rights of any political party. The kind of first sentence of the animal rights chapter of our policies, or first paragraph, includes the line, "The prevailing assumption that animals can be used for any purpose that benefits humankind is not acceptable in a green society." So that gives you the idea of the starting principles on which everything is based. Yeah, this is our animal rights chapter.
Can I just check? Is that word use?
Used for any purpose.
That's really important.
Yeah.
Because that's about, the vegan message.
The mic's still on. You've got a bit quiet.
Opposed to the commodification of animals. And one of the things we'll be coming to in a minute actually is how important it is to focus on the use. And the use is the fundamental justice. It's not the treatment. How we treat animals and the welfare of animals is not the fundamental role. The fundamental role is that we use them in the first place. So I've never heard that from the Green Party.
Yeah.
This has got more of an animal rights message than most of the vegan campaign groups have. So that's a big plus. Well,
yeah. So to give you, so obviously our entire policy book is different to what we might be able to deliver. Because being realistic, we do have a chance of getting a handful of Green MPs elected at the next general election. We don't have a chance of getting the keys to number 10 at the next election, I'll acknowledge that.
If only.
But that's okay, because our theory of change involves influencing whoever does form the next government, looking extremely likely to be Labour, and pulling them in the right direction on areas where they're not so strong. And MPs can achieve that through proposing motions, asking questions, proposing amendments to motions from the government, and so on. And so to give you a couple of examples of things that Greens are working on now already, so way back in 2017, when 17 or 18, I can't remember, when Brexit was going through, when the EU withdrawal bill was going through, Caroline Lucas, our Green MP currently, proposed an animal sentience amendment to the withdrawal bill. Now that amendment fell. However, I do think that it had a pivotal role in sparking that awareness in government that ultimately then led to the animal sentience bill passing and becoming law 5 or so years later. And so that's an example of what us Greens often describe as the effect of just one Green in the room can change everything, because we don't necessarily have to be the government. We are often the ones that put forward ideas that politicians from other parties hadn't thought of, but don't necessarily disagree with, and once we've put them on the table, we can work cross-party and get support from politicians from other positions on the political spectrum, but we can find common ground and work together. Another interesting area the Greens are working on locally and nationally is the idea of rights of nature. So this is thinking of nature and nature having inherent rights in the same way that humans and animals have inherent rights. So there's been work going on about this internationally, and nationally our ecology spokesperson, so our shadow cabinet member effectively, Jonathan Elmer, who's a councillor in Durham, has been doing a lot of work with some NGOs about developing policy around rights of nature that could work at a national government level. And meanwhile, Greens on several, elected Greens on several local councils have managed to pass motions that recognise inherent rights of, for example, rivers running through the area, and then using that as a tool to challenge pollution of rivers and that obviously harm to animals and so on. So inherent rights of a river to flow and to not be polluted and so on and so forth, which I think is a really interesting idea that when you first hear it, lots of people, including me, are like, huh? Why? And then you read more about it and go, oh, actually, yeah, that does make a lot of sense.
I've got to say, it's music to my ears to hear you talking not only about rights, nature rights, it's a fabulous idea, protecting rivers, recognising too, of course, for example, rivers have a lot of free living beings. So it's also upholding the rights of free living beings is a really important area that tends to get left off the vegan thing. We tend to focus on farmed animals, animals in captivity. But the free living beings is a really important area. In fact, at our Vegan Party conference, we'll be doing a panel in September about protecting free living beings as part of an essential tenet of the vegan position. But it's also really refreshing to hear you talk about animal rights. And actually rights for animals is something that's got a little bit lost. Partly, and I'm just going to come on to this, and this is a challenge for you, Carla, because if you do get into power, one of the things about being an MP is that actually you're then quite limited in some respects what you can, but then you're also set free to achieve other things. But with animals, it tends to be that we're still in this welfare paradigm. You know, for 200 years, the UK has prided itself on the highest welfare standards. A little example to show you is the animal rising protest last year at Aintree, in a very high profile, the result of which a lot of media, over 1,000 media pieces, mostly positive about, big support for banning horse racing. Of course, 6 months later, the Grand National team turned around and introduced a number of welfare reforms. They've made the fences lower, they've done this, they've done that, the other. They've basically tidied up their industry in order to keep it going.
Horses are still dying.
One of the problems we've got with the welfare paradigm is that most of the reforms in Parliament for animals are welfare reforms. And there's a danger for some of us that the longer we keep working and focusing on this welfare area, the less we actually uphold the rights of animals not to be used in the first place.
Right.
So I was just saying, do you feel there's a bit of a contradiction maybe in some of the work you might be able to achieve in Parliament? How do you feel about that?
That's a really interesting question. I think certainly, as you've heard, the way I and the way the Green Party thinks of it is in terms of animal rights rather than animal welfare predominantly. However, I don't think that's a reason to oppose any work that's going on to progress animal welfare. It just perhaps is not the area that I would personally focus my efforts on quite so much. But there are policies in our, in our policy book that are, some are more focused on rights and some are more focused on, while this industry continues to exist, we would regulate it better to improve welfare. But often there is an underlying theme of and heading towards it happening less or not at all. So I'll give you an example, a little insight actually, because this policy isn't yet our policy, but it's something that people are working on. A motion came, also an insight into how the Green Party sets its policy. So unlike other parties, Green Party policy is set by our members at conference, one member, one vote. So by contrast, in the Labour Party, if the leader doesn't like it, they can veto, and that's the end of that. It won't be in the manifesto. I don't have that power, so to an extent, I'm a little bit more a spokesperson for the party. I don't get to single-handedly decide, and any member can bring a motion to conference. Obviously, it would be chaos if people just kind of chucked in half-baked ideas they thought of on the train there. So there is a process of collecting co-signatories and then it going through a prioritisation process, but the prioritisation is also done by members voting. And this process led to a motion coming to our autumn conference that strengthened our policies on animal racing. So originally it was a reform and better welfare basically. So it was ending the use of whips in horse racing, only using straight tracks for greyhound racing, etc. The motion was to ban greyhound racing altogether and to work towards an eventual ban in all animal racing. Now there were some problems with the details of that motion that would have had some unintended consequences, so it ended up getting referred back to the author for a little bit more work, so it isn't yet our policy, but it is something that I, Adrian, my co-leader, and Zach, our deputy leader, all supported. So once that does come back to conference with a little bit more work, that I hope will pass at the conference.
That's really exciting news to hear, Carla, and I must say I'm really thrilled that the Green Party actually wants to ban things. They don't want to regulate them, they want to ban. Yeah. That's the key difference. It's not easy. No. And I understand why there's a discussion to be had about welfare steps. I get that. But ultimately we want to stop this. Set these animals free. Animal liberation is the goal of the vegan way of life. So that's really interesting to hear that. I can
And that decision of kind of regulate or just stop it happening is the thing that progressive organisations and parties, I think, often have to weigh up, is starting from where we are now, not starting from the utopia that we're heading for. What's the best way of getting there? Is it step by step or not? And although I supported that motion, there are other circumstances where I might argue for a more gradual approach. I think it is the art of the possible and thinking about what society is ready for and what's actually feasible. Yes. And also lesser, even in things like racing, you do have to think about people whose livelihoods depend on it and what support the government will be providing for them to find alternative employment.
Certainly farmers, the racing industry is to go out. I think there's over 100,000 people earning a living from racing.
Exactly.
It's really important to look at that too.
Yeah, so there has to be a just transition, and we think a lot about just transition in terms of people that work on oil rigs, but it would equally apply to stuff like this.
So I think that it's important to remember there's a big difference between system change and individual change.
Yeah.
With individual change, we can ask people to go vegan on a matter of justice, ask them to not use animals, quite simply and straightforward. With system change, no, it's complicated, and really it's incremental steps with system change. So the only way you can do it really is by people agreeing and having a consensus. And that's a different process. We're getting a bit close to time. I wanted to ask you actually just move on to a really interesting area that I'd like to ask you. You touched on that. You kind of mentioned about how other social justice movements have had to develop and how we got to these points. The animal rights movement has traditionally been quite, not that great at collaborating with other justice movements. And it seems to me, things like the LGBTQ+, feminists, are very much two groups of we are allied, we have a lot in common, we've got a lot of shared values. My feeling is that the animal rights movement can sometimes shoot itself in the foot, but doesn't really make itself very attractive, if you like, to different social justice groups. So Carla, how important is that the vegan movement steps up and really integrates with other justice movements?
Yeah, I think it's really important. Otherwise, our activism can have unintended negative consequences.
Absolutely.
I think the example that comes most readily to mind to me is that if we're not well connected with, for example, like the Black Lives Matter movement, then we might leave ignorant opinions about Islam and Judaism unchallenged because we don't properly understand. So yeah, I think it's really important to have an intersectional approach to campaigning and make sure you're not inadvertently campaigning for something that actually excludes a whole section of society when it doesn't need to.
And traditionally we have, as an animal rights movement, if you look at some of the campaigning in the 80s and 90s especially, it wasn't very friendly to an inclusive approach, was it? It was quite something. I think when people
actually, on that specifically, do go along to the Grand Iftar if you're not already. So yes, Ramadan at the moment. There are 2 Grand Iftar events happening in Bristol. One is next weekend on Sunday evening on Stapleton Road, and the other one is this coming Thursday on College Green. I think the College Green one's sold out, but I think the Stapleton Road one is just a rock up. And at least the College Green one is all vegan. It's basmati rice and samosas and snacks, basically.
Nice.
I don't know about the Stapleton Road one, maybe check, but because they're aware that they're catering for lots of different people, I think often the common denominator it ends up being vegan or mostly vegan. So don't take my word on that for the Stapleton Road one, because that's not the one I'm able to go to, unfortunately. But do have a look, and yeah, good opportunity for a little bit of getting to know your community.
Brilliant. I'm really happy to do that. And I do believe that the power, plant-based, we can really pull together different communities. I really believe in breaking down those barriers and coming together. I remember doing a speaking fair actually in 2007 when we first did it in the amphitheatre. We had this traditionally Jewish Moroccan family, they're all in traditional Jewish dress, with food, Bedouin tent style. And right next door to a Muslim family cooking up loads of food. It was just wonderful to feel that we were joining in and we were celebrating what we had in common. And it was a wonderful feeling. I believe veganism can really do that, but I do think we need to, as you said, we need to take that intersectional framework and avoid shooting ourselves in the foot and putting off natural allies, and make sure that we are trans-inclusive, we are inclusive of all religions, and that we are inclusive, and that we work on our own bias and we work on our own conditioning and evolve. And for me, veganism is as much about self-transformation as it is about not using animals, improving your health, helping the environment, and ensuring food justice. Self-transformation, as the famous and that sea quote is the greatest gift you can give, is the gift of self-transformation. I'm sure we're going to have a few questions. If anybody I'm not going to ask you to ask questions yet, just give me a raise of hands, just so we see there's one or two questions. We'll leave time for that. A couple of questions just for Carla before we end, and go some questions. How confident are you of creating lasting change for future generations?
On vegan and animal rights stuff, or generally? Generally. I think, for me at least, confident isn't quite the right word, but hopeful is. Because to me, confident conveys a sort of sitting back and watching it happen, whereas hope for me is a matter of active hope and being involved in making it happen. And in fact, there's a poem. Do I have it? Yes. Okay. I want to share this with you because I think it conveys my approach to hope and making change. It's by a poet called Jared K. Anderson. We seldom admit the seductive comfort of hopelessness. It saves us from ambiguity. It has an answer for every question. There's just no point. Hope, on the other hand, is messy. If it might all work out, then we have things to do. We must weather the possibility of happiness.
Nice.
So I think that's an approach that I take, and I think all of us can take, to not just wondering if it's going to work out, but actively involving ourselves in making it so.
What would be your overriding message to the vegan movement if you were addressing the vegan party, which we don't have a political party, but we do like have the party, but if you were going to be addressing, address to the nation of vegans, what would you be saying to them right now?
Cook for your friends that are not vegan yet. I have accidentally turned quite a few of my friends and partners vegan, and I wasn't even really trying, I was just cooking the curry. And then there was a partner from years and years ago, we broke up years ago amicably, stayed in touch, and I got a message the other day saying, me and my partner and my toddler are all vegan. The toddler's been vegan since birth, and that's all down to you. So, I think, I think that has more of an activist effect than you might realise.
I agree, cooking and socialising, community spirit, and really helping each other. There is a bit of a divide between vegans and non-vegans. To stand up for animal rights and still talk to non-vegans in an encouraging way is an art form. It does need practice. We're going to take questions. Simon.
Thank you very much. Simon West, proud Green Party member.
One moment. There is actually a spare mic, so let's pass it around and then everyone else, including the recording, can hear.
Simon West, proud Green Party member and co-founder of International Reforestation Charity. Carla, when you become an MP, if you could wave a magic wand and get an early day motion that is definitely going to go all the way through to proper debate, what early day motion would you propose?
Assuming I'm only getting one, I think it wouldn't be only on animal rights, it would be more broadly on the environment. But there would, as we heard, there's all this stuff about the environment, but also food justice. Some of you will be aware of the Zero Carbon Britain report that showed how we can get to a Zero Carbon Britain, which included reallocating some of the land use, or a lot of the land use, away from producing animal feed to producing feed directly for humans. I think it would be an early day motion around how actually putting into law how we get to net zero.
Thank you.
Yes, gentleman behind. Thank you.
Hello, Mira, proud vegan runner, and yeah, very lovely to hear you talking. And just basically, my wife and I, we live in your constituency, and we both work in the arts. Obviously, Fangham is that's one of her sort of stronger kind of lines of policy in her own personal interest. But we believe and support everything you're saying about all the things you talked about today, and just to kind of knock us off the fence and have us vote for you rather than Fangham, what is your personal approach to kind of arts policy and the importance of, you know, the current government have just eroded all sorts of things over the last 13 years, and funding for orchestras and things that we work with is a real sort of personal situation for us.
Yeah.
And I know it's not necessarily of huge interest to everyone in the room, but it is to us. And just wondered what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, arts and culture are really important to the Green Party as well, and that's something that as a party we've been quite active on, especially challenging decisions made around funding at a national and local level. Obviously there's the overarching reason for a lot of the underfunding is the austerity agenda generally, and the Green Party is the only major party that's consistently challenged the austerity agenda. Obviously it was Conservative and Lib Dem coalition government that delivered it, but what is often forgotten about now is that there really wasn't very much disagreement from the Labour Party at the time that was the course of action that they needed to follow, and it was really only the Green Party in England speaking up and saying that is not how you build a better society, and I feel like that's been borne out over the last 14 years. So we would be funding arts and culture alongside public services much better, and we're not afraid to say that the way you do that is to reform the tax system to make it fairer, because there are so many parts of the tax system where there are whopping great big deliberate loopholes that mean that people on lower incomes pay a higher proportion of their income on taxes than people on higher incomes because of various caps and so on. So we would flip that around, and we'd introduce a wealth tax on the very richest, so that's only billionaires and multi-millionaires, and even a modest wealth tax on the wealth above £10 million would raise a lot alongside other reforms to the tax system around capital gains and national insurance would, by the end of next Parliament, raise over £50 billion a year. So we are quite frustrated when we hear the Labour Shadow Chancellor say there's no magic money tree. There is actually. We are still one of the richest economies in the world. There is money in the economy. It's about having the political will to say who you would ask for that money from. And that would go, towards arts and culture. And then at a local level, at a local level, some of my Green Councillor colleagues have done a great job, I think, of challenging some of the decisions made where a lot of funding has been cut for some of the smaller organisations, when, of course, smaller cultural venues are often where the next generation of stars are born, and if you don't support those, then it'll have a huge detrimental effect on the whole sector a few years later.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carla. We've got time for one more question. I have to ask you to be brief, because we don't want to overrun for our
This
meetings.
MP was up early, if
Oh.
we can go to this one.
Thank you.
Hi there. My name's Letters. I'm non-binary. I've been vegan for around 5 years now. Over that. I think like a lot of Bristolians here will agree with me that our public transport system isn't great.
Plymouth.
And I know obviously public transport is something that will be important to the Green Party when we're talking about the realm of environmentalism. So I guess what do you think? What would like Green Party's commitment be to public transport in Bristol? Whether there's considering alternatives to it or putting it more in control of the council, etc.
Cool, thank you for your question. This isn't something that, if I'm elected as MP, I wouldn't have any control over, although I would be using my role as an MP to push for changes in funding legislation at a national level. At a local level, my Green colleagues who'll be hopefully re-elected and get some new ones elected on the council, we will be pushing, for improved public transport definitely, including, exactly as you referenced, more council control over public transport. So a very quick rundown for those who aren't familiar. In this country, a lot of public transport used to be run by councils. Most councils privatised, sold off to people like First Bus. And then in 2017, the Conservative government closed that door and bolted it shut with the Bus Act, which meant that councils aren't allowed to set up publicly owned bus companies.
Yeah.
So at a national level, we would challenge and try to reverse that. In the meantime, though, there is a halfway house, which is bus franchising, which is not full public ownership of bus services, but it does mean councils have some influence over, or much more influence over routes, frequencies and fares, rather than the current completely privatised model. So it's effectively a contract between the council and the bus company to say you have to provide this in order to win the contract. That is what they have had in London for many years. London's buses are obviously an order of magnitude better than Bristol's buses. It's not only because of franchising, they also have more funding per head of population than we do, but it would certainly be a start. And so that's something that I personally have been very involved in campaigning for. It's not Bristol City Council, but the next level up, the West of England Combined Authority, that has that power. I was lobbying the previous Metro Mayor and the current one to bring this in for the last 5 or 6 years. The current Labour Metro Mayor, Dan Norris, I would say is sort of fairly far to the right within the Labour Party. He's fairly centrist. He initially was not amenable to the idea of bus franchising, but after Andy Burnham made the decision to bring it in Manchester, I think Dan Norris may have noticed how popular that was in Manchester, and a week later he was up in Manchester getting a selfie with Andy Burnham saying that he was going to look into bus franchising in Bristol as well. So I don't know how much I can claim personal credit for Dan Norris's Damascene conversion, but it's certainly good news that while they haven't committed to it, they're at least looking into it now, and that would give local authorities much more power to improve public transport. And I think there's also something about what kind of public transport. So you'll probably be aware that the mayor, the current Labour mayor, Marvin Rees, is very keen on having an underground. Now, I'd love Bristol to have an underground, but you know, my background's in engineering. I know how long big civil engineering infrastructure projects take. If we decide we want an underground now, it might be running in 20 years with a tailwind, you know, maybe longer. We're in a climate emergency. We can't wait that long to have a good quality public transport system. So reluctantly, I and Bristol Green Party we're open to evidence and data and being told that we're wrong, but we are leaning more towards the less sexy but more quickly deliverable bus option rather than the very expensive, lengthy underground option.
Okay, that's brilliant. That's a really good one. Well done, Carla. We have come to the end of our time. So Carla's got one last question, and you're only allowed to give 30 seconds, okay? Because we don't want to keep our comedy crowd waiting. And we've had a very interesting 45 minutes, 50 minutes. One last question for Carla Denyer. How important is it for the people of the UK that you win Bristol Central?
Very.
Okay, great, thanks. Bristol Central is probably the best chance in the whole of the UK of getting a new Green MP elected.
Right.
So if you live in the Bristol Central constituency, even if you really want to see a Labour government,
No.
would you rather have a 100% Labour government, or would you like to see a Labour government with a handful of Green MPs elected to pull them in the right direction on all the stuff that they're not so hot on? If the latter sounds like a better idea to you, and you live in Bristol Central, then you live in one of the places where you have an incredibly strong power, much more so than most voters in this country, to make that happen with your vote.
Carla Denyer.
Yeah.